Crying Sun's pitch is pretty straightforward. What if we made FTL, but with an actual plot attached to it? And it makes a pretty valiant effort to do so without abandoning the addicting, hectic gameplay of the game that inspired it. But while Crying Suns might directly compare itself to FTL, it changes enough of the formula up to stand on its own, with entirely different combat and a few additional systems to set it apart even beyond the narrative focus. There's a lot to cover here, so let's dive in. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're restoring the Empire in Crying Suns. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free advance review copy for this game, so heads up. Crying Sun's mission statement openly invites comparison to FTL, so let's start by making one. What FTL spits out at you in a single sentence or paragraph, Crying Suns consistently builds an entire scene out of. In FTL, answering a space station's distress call might give you a 2-sentence blurb explaining the situation. But in Crying Suns, you'll show up at a planet, get hailed, have a whole paragraph as the planet's denizens appeal to you for help, and can ask additional questions about the situation, or send one of your lieutenants to gather more information. Playing things out can make Crying Suns feel significantly slower paced than its inspiration, but in most cases, the extra time investment pays off. The game uses that time to introduce a steady cast of officers and lieutenants to bounce off of, who often get their own opportunities for sarcastic quips and asides, making even one-off side missions feel impactful and engaging. But that's only the beginning of Crying Sun's attempts to attach a full-fledged narrative to an FTL-esque roguelike. Here again, FTL gives you a quick 2-sentence setup with a MacGuffin you have to take from point A to B, while Crying Suns spends its entire first half hour spinning up a sci-fi narrative for you to dive into. The skinny is that the Empire is dying. It's run by these machines called Omnis, who so vastly outstrip humanity in computing power that they've basically taken over all major jobs in society, from harvesting food and controlling a planet's atmosphere to inventing entirely new fields of science. And one day, they all simultaneously shut off, and in their absence, humanity is only hanging on by the most tenuous thread possible. And it's up to you to restore the status quo before the last vestiges of humanity die from their planets rapidly irradiating and their entire infrastructure collapsing. And in this setup, there's one more comparison to make to FTL. Whereas FTL kinda made it feel like every node you landed on was its own mini Star Trek episode, Crying Suns reminds me of a very different serialized adventure. And of all things, it's Fist of the North Star. お前はもう死んでいる. Like, yeah, there are capital ships, AI companions, and the bones of a whole galaxy-spanning empire to explore, but also you're a legendary soul hero wandering through a post-apocalyptic hellscape where everything is barren, everyone is dead or dying, every last one of your enemies are hilariously evil and sadistic bandit overlords whose only modes are murder and oppress, and the plot is primarily centered around playing up these villains' cruelty and prowess to hype them up for when it's time to knock them back down. If I'm being honest, the broad strokes of Crying Sun's larger narrative aren't really grabbing me. Half the game's plot so far has been expositional dumps on how the universe works and why it, stopped working, and the other 50% has been expositional dumps on the villains who rule over each sector and all the awful ways they operate. Your actual main quest, to figure out why the Omnis turned off and how to get them working again, largely consists of shaking down those various antagonists for information in a breadcrumb trail that is stretched extraordinarily thin across each 3-hour run. But the moment-to-moment is still enjoyable. Part of that is what we already covered about how Crying Suns handles individual events, and part of it is just the game's presentation, which is all around phenomenal. Art design and UI are top-notch, there's a very cinematic presentation to the proceedings that gives them further weight, and there are a ton of great little details, like how you can watch your opponent's ship slowly detonate in the view screen while you decide what to do after beating them. That said, I've also been running into a lot of repeat events, and once you've been offered a pirate treasure map 3 times, even twice in the same run, you kind of know exactly how that entire questline is gonna go. The fact that I'm already running into this problem after a scant 3 runs and only 2 out of 5 chapters into the game doesn't bode well for the moment-to-moment mini-stories keeping me invested all the way until I finally make it to the final chapter. The gameplay, on the other hand, just might. Crying Sun's gameplay can be easily divided into three pieces: the metagame, expeditions, and combat. The metagame is where you'll see FTL's influence the strongest. You get a star map with branching paths to explore, with each system filled with its own series of events, shops, and quests to go on. But the game doesn't allow you to dawdle and farm, as there's a steady wave of punishingly difficult enemies always a jump or two behind, driving you forward. And in the meantime, you'll be slowly leveling up your ship by buying new equipment and expanding its capabilities to accommodate. Expeditions, meanwhile, are a pretty straightforward side diversion. Every once in a while, you'll come across a planet you can explore for resources, which you send down an officer to gather on their own little mini-mission. You get to track what's going on from your ship, but the mission's largely out of your hands, and the only choice you can make is whether to call it off early or not based on how it's going. Its most important contributions are to be a primary source of money, while also forcing you to balance an additional resource in the form of commandos, aka red shirts that are constantly going and dying on every away mission. So it has a meaningful place in the metagame, but as far as a self-contained system, it's pretty basic, if enjoyable to look at. But combat is where this game really comes together. You get thrown onto a real-time hex grid with you and your opponent on opposite ends, and slowly engage in a tense, incredibly fast-paced tug-of-war. The bulk of your strategy will usually revolve around squadrons, smaller ships that can run around the board and stake out your battle lines in that tug-of-war, and your ship's main guns are more of a support tool you get to pull out 2 or 3 times in a fight. And the situation in any given fight is constantly changing. It can take just 5 seconds to fly from one end of the board to the other, but that time can feel like an eternity. A whole new wave of enemies could show up in that time, and if they catch you in an unfavorable position, you could stand to lose your entire board presence in one swoop and suddenly find yourself fighting right next to your own capital ship, which can also be torn to shreds in about the same amount of time. And thanks to a rock-paper-scissors system between the different squadron types, you're constantly cycling between ships, which requires one squadron to come back and dock before you can send a new one out. Managing space becomes all the more critical, and when you're on your opponent's side of the board doing damage, arguably when you should be in your most dominant position, is also when you're at your most vulnerable. But it's time to answer the all-important question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Crying Suns? And seeing as I'm only on chapter 2 of 5, I feel like I'm only dipping my toes into this one. But paradoxically, I also feel like I'm already hitting the limits of what this game has to offer in some respects, with events and quests already repeating and becoming familiar on the regular. Which leads me to feel like Crying Suns is probably a game I won't play to completion, but also like I'm okay with that. The journey is the real fun here, and that can last as long or little as you like. If you're interested in narrative delivery first, you'll find tighter and more engaging options elsewhere, but if you're looking for an enjoyable roguelite, Crying Sun's stab at a more narrative-focused game gives it a bit more meat than your average entry in the genre, and its gameplay more than backs it up. I know we're not exactly starved for options when it comes to roguelikes, but this one earns its place. Speaking of wasteland roving sci-fi roguelikes, you might also dig Nowhere Prophet, which I did a review on recently. And if you want something even more narratively focused in a similar setting, check out what I had to say about Heaven's Vault. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. If you did, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. If you're looking for games that value your time and don't pad themselves, I'm your guy. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.